Hello and welcome to this edition of Talking Point. He is an engineer by training, a widely respected technocrat, credited with ushering in a new revolution in the energy efficiency sector. He is also a renowned name in the climate change circuit, and at the moment he is heading India's leading organization, the Energy Research Institute. I'm joined by none other than Mr. Ajay Mathur in Talking Point today. Welcome to the show, Mr. Mathur.
Wonderful to be here with you.
Mr. Mathur, you have worn several hats in the last 3 decades of your career. Which role among all these portfolios that you've held is the most closest to your heart, and why?
Well, I have recently demitted office as Director General of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. And the 9 years that I spent as Director General have probably been the most satisfying till now. This was a period in which we were able to bring energy efficiency into our homes, offices, and factories. We were able to connect with people who responded to the star labeling program in our homes, who responded to the Perform, Achieve and Trade program in industry, who responded to the Energy Conservation Building Code in commercial buildings, and who have most recently responded in such large measure to the LED lighting program that has been launched. So we have seen a sea change in people's attitudes and in the market. This is a combination of policies, of market intervention, and of regulation. And seeing this happen has brought great satisfaction.
There is a common thread which connects all the important career portfolios that you've held in the last 3 decades, and that is the subject of energy. And besides your expertise on this issue, what is it that attracts you the most towards this subject?
You know, Shalini, energy is the one thing in the world which we, on the one hand, need. It's essential. If you don't get enough energy, you can't work, you can't cook, you can't move. But on the other hand, it's also a product which has a huge amount of use, which is in a sense discretionary. I can decide to drive to the market, I can decide to walk. So this mix of necessity and an optional use is almost unique. This makes it a very exciting subject. You need to make sure everybody has adequate and affordable energy. You also need to make sure that everybody has access to energy, but use it efficiently. These two things together make this one of the most exciting areas to work in.
And at the same time, very challenging. You have seen India's energy program very closely, and you must be able to throw more light on India's energy requirements and at the production end, if we are able to really keep pace with our requirements.
Over the past 10 years, this country has seen a huge change on the production side. We still do import a huge amount of the petroleum that we use. But more importantly, we now generate more electricity than is actually bought by the electricity companies. This is very different from the situation earlier when we did not even have the capacity to generate as much electricity as people needed. This has been brought about by a number of changes, but the most important part is that if we are able to get prices right, which implies that distribution companies on the one hand should not make losses, but on the other hand, electricity is available to us at prices that we are willing and able to pay. If these two things come together, then there is really no shortage of electricity for anybody in the country. The second issue is that on the production side, we have also seen a huge growth in the efficiency of power generation. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the average efficiency of generation in the coal power plants was something in the vicinity of 32%. People said it was 30, it was actually slightly better, it was 32. Today, it's in excess of 35%. Every new plant that is being built uses the very efficient supercritical technology. Some are using what is known as ultra supercritical technology, and the country has a huge mission on what is known as advanced ultra supercritical technology. In other words, every new coal-based power station that will be built will be more efficient than the last. You put these two things together, and we are moving towards a future in which we will be using electricity, we'll be using coal more efficiently in power generation, and will have enough, or already have enough, electricity for the needs of the country.
But what about this basic thrust which has been given to the renewable energy sector? There has been a lot which has been talked about. The government last year in its budget had proposed a target of 1,75,000 megawatts of power generation through the renewable sources by 2022, a large share of it going in the solar energy kitty. How achievable is this target?
First of all, renewables are amazingly important to us. Even while we are producing a lot of electricity from coal, we still have to import coal. This is something none of us had thought would be needed. I hope that the country does enough domestic production that in the future imports are not needed. We also have an issue of making electricity available for all. We also have an issue of environmental quality. All of this means that we must use the source that is easily available to us, renewables. It is in this background that the country has set up the huge target of 100 gigawatts of solar and 60 gigawatts of wind by 2022. And in fact, we've also promised in the intended nationally determined contribution that we have submitted to the climate change agreement that at least 40% of the electricity capacity in the country in 2030 would be sourced from non-fossil fuels. This is a challenging goal. Can we achieve this? Well, let me give you one statistic. In only 4 years ago, a kilowatt hour, a unit of electricity produced from solar used to cost something like 18 rupees. A few weeks ago, when we had the latest auction, the price was down to 4 rupees 32 paisa. So we have seen a huge decline. What this implies is that for each rupee invested in solar, we are able to get a lot more solar electricity and at lower prices. So one, I think we should be able to have the technology to do it. We have the declining prices in order to go ahead. But there is one technical drawback and one commercial drawback. The technical drawback is that as we have more and more renewable energy in the grid, we have the problem of what will happen when the sun stops shining and the wind stops blowing.
Which is also a reality.
Right. So if there is no wind at night, where does the electricity come from? This means that we need a second source. Now, if I have to install as much coal electricity as solar and renewables, which only comes on when solar and wind are not available, that's amazingly expensive. So therefore, what the country has to look for are storage technologies. One is pumped storage. So you've got a hydro dam with the reservoir at 2 levels. When you have excess electricity, say from sun or wind, it pumps the water up. And when you need more electricity, it pumps the water down. We and the rest of the world are also working on technologies which will store electricity, for example, in batteries. In other words, this is a technical solution. This storage solution is something that the world is waiting for. That's one. The second is commercial. In solar energy and wind energy, all the money that is needed to produce the electricity is put upfront. In a coal power plant, there is some money which is put upfront, but then you pay for coal over a period of time. So when I'm setting up a solar power plant, I need to borrow a lot of money. Consequently, the cost of borrowing is very important. The cost of borrowing in India is 12 to 13%. And at this price, it means that the electricity is already 30, 40, 50 paisa more expensive than if the borrowing was about 4% less. We therefore need mechanisms by which we can provide lower cost capital. You know, in most of the developed world, money is available at 3%. Is there a mechanism by which, if not at 3%, then at 6 or 7 or 8%, this money can be made available? This is something the government is seriously thinking about. The Power Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal, has put in a lot of effort, has had a lot of consultations, papers being made on what are the mechanisms through which this can be done. So, the technical challenge on the one side and this commercial challenge on the other side, these are the two things which, as they are successfully implemented, we would see a much larger amount of wind and solar in the grid than even what we have promised.
Okay. And what about the investment in this sector? How should the investment be boosted?
Investment in energy is going to happen anyway. The key is we want to draw it into this sector. Challenge is that you need to put in more money per megawatt than you would for coal. So, what we need is that the investor gets a remunerative return on solar and the same kind of return that he would get on coal. Because overall in the world, there isn't a shortage of money. The point is it needs to be brought in. So, if we are able to provide remunerative rates of return, and at the same time we are able to provide lower cost of money, if we are able to do this equation together, I don't think that attracting money to this sector will be a problem.
Is it a tough and a challenging task here, Mr. Mathur, since, you know, whenever one talks about providing electricity to Indians, there is this additional factor of affordability along with the accessibility and availability. And do you think that's one of the most important key challenges which the policymakers, the government will have to do?
It is. If, you know, there are something like 25% Indian households who still do not have access to electricity or for that matter to clean cooking fuel. As these are also families at the bottom of the income and social pyramid. Their ability and willingness to pay for energy is limited. And consequently, it is important that we provide them electricity at prices that they are physically able to pay. If they don't have the money, it doesn't make any difference. This means that in the short term, we need to make sure that cheap electricity is available. Today, cheap electricity is coal. And that is why we would have to have a mix of coal together with other sources, renewables, but also nuclear, also hydro, also all other sources that are available.
Okay, and internationally some developments have taken place, including the Solar Alliance. If you can please throw some light on how it is going to push for the agenda that some developing nations, including India, has regarding harnessing of solar energy.
The vast amount of solar energy is available in the tropics of the world. These are the countries where the largest potential for solar electricity generation occurs. And therefore, what the Prime Minister's ambition was, if these countries come together, share their experiences, in a sense you don't have to reinvent the wheel for many countries. We learn from each other. The second is that if we are able to do specifications together, then in the market it is very clear that a very large number of countries are going to buy solar panels of a particular specification. Production would increase, volumes would increase, and everybody, all the countries in the alliance, would gain from lower prices. And a third and related point is that if this alliance is able to provide enough ambition to enough countries, why? Because they see the benefits. Then there is also the issue of bringing together demand. And so many countries, so many companies together, when they invest in this area, they invest in the R&D, that's another reason for prices to fall.
Mr. Mathur, do you think that the world at large has finally realized that it's energy and economy in that order that is going to really test the might of these nations, and that's why they need to be self-reliant?
There is a clear challenge that the economic development as we know occurs on the back of cheap energy. This is how every country in the world has developed. And the challenge to us today is that we live in a world where energy is more expensive than it was, say, 100 years ago in real terms. This makes development more expensive. And at the same time, we also have the challenge of climate change,
Yeah.
which means that we would like to increase the share of renewables, which today are more expensive than coal, in the grid. Now, when you bring these two things together, that becomes a huge challenge. On the one hand, have adequate amount of cheap energy so that everybody has adequate energy, and on the other hand, also bring in enough renewables so that you can reduce the amount of carbon emissions for each unit of electricity that is produced in the country.
You had represented India at the Paris climate change negotiations. How difficult was it to sail through this Paris round, and has India achieved a part of what it had expected in Paris?
I had the honor of being part of the Indian delegation to the climate change negotiations in Paris. And as we reached there, the first thing that struck us was the immense amount of bad press that we were getting. India was called obstructive. It was said that India is going to use so much coal that it will swamp the world. You know, the overall feeling was that this agreement will not happen. These talks will fail because of Indian actions. And nothing could be further than the truth. I mean, this country was the first country in the world, bar none, to place emphasis on renewables. You know, we created a Department of Renewables back in the 70s. We have had a very successful energy efficiency program. But for a variety of reasons, we were still seen as being negative. This was one problem. The second problem at Paris was that if we needed an effective agreement, it meant that countries needed to move away from their established positions, including us. In the past, we've had the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol gave targets to the developed countries on how much their carbon emissions should be. Now, what we learned from the Kyoto Protocol experience was that as countries found that they could not meet their targets, they walked out of the protocol. This was of no help to anybody. Very clearly, therefore, a top-down approach does not work in such a case. Therefore, what this agreement has done is put in a framework, an architecture, in which each country says what it will do, puts out a very transparent reporting and monitoring system, shows that it has achieved what it said, and then goes on to adopt more ambitious targets. We believe that this combination of the fact that I deliver on what I promise, and I have the trust that others will also deliver on what they promise, will create a virtuous cycle in which countries will achieve, promise more, achieve that, and so on. And that media and civil society will hold each country responsible for delivering on the actions that they have promised. That's why the transparent reporting mechanism. I think what we have got at Paris is a very good architecture to move ahead. I think what we also have in India is the experience that once you start pushing renewables and energy efficiency, you deliver, you're able to get much more than what you thought. The two things together, I think, put us as well as other countries on a path that we can both meet the energy needs as well as start addressing the climate needs. Very clearly, what all the countries have promised till now on climate is not adequate. But the architecture that we can ratchet it up, that we can keep on doing more as we find that we are able to do what we have promised, provides the link, the wedge for each one of us to be able to help the world meet its climate change problem.
Mr. Mathur, is it also about change in attitudes which the developing world would like and expect from the developed countries? Because many believe that though the developing nations and the developed ones, they are getting closer, but in terms of actions, in terms of the developed world ready to accommodate the needs of the developing nations, there's still a long way to go.
There is absolutely no doubt that it is the developed nations where the vast amount of carbon emissions have occurred in the past and continue to occur today. Though, as you rightly say, the share of developing countries is increasing. There is also no doubt that given their economic capacity, they can do a lot more than what they are doing. There is also no doubt that the developed countries have not met the technology and financing challenges, the promises that they themselves made at previous climate negotiations. But I think what is also important is that we need to move ahead. We need to hold the developed countries to task, make sure that they deliver on their promises, but at the same time, all of us, developed and developing countries, move forward in addressing in our own ways, and that's why the pledges are important. It's your pledge. In our own ways, what is important to have the entire global climate emissions become less and less in the years ahead.
You've been associated with the Green Climate Fund too. How do you think it can help the countries cope or deal with the climate challenge?
The Green Climate Fund was established by the Climate Change Convention as a source of funding for activities to mitigate climate change, to adapt to climate change by developing countries, with the funding being provided by developed countries. And it was initially thought that a very large part of the $100 billion a year that the developed countries would provide would be channeled through the Green Climate Fund. I was associated with it in its first year when there was an interim secretariat which I headed. It's now a fully operational fund operating out of Songdo in Korea. And I think what has been promised to it is about $10 billion. What they've actually received is about $5 billion. But the greatest challenge that they have is in finding good projects and in finding the channels through which they can move that money. Because you need to do due diligence, you need to make sure that the work is done, you need to make sure that the money is used rightly. Till now, I think 8 projects worth $160 million, all of them in smaller countries, have been approved. It's a good start, but for it to be effective, we will need a much larger, we must see it do much larger action. And for that, we need to have much better access to it. For example, India is a country which has a lot of development banks, agricultural development bank, housing development bank. These could be very effective channels to move the Green Climate Fund money so that they add local money and they say, if you do things on renewables, if you do things on more efficient buildings, if you do things on agriculture that addresses the impacts of climate change, then the GCF money sweetens that deal. Then you and I need not go to the Green Climate Fund in Korea to get it. We only need to go to IREDA or HDFC or HUDCO, or NABARD, to get these resources.
Okay. And coming back to India, how real is this environmental threat? And have we done enough to avert any catastrophic climate risk or disaster in future?
You know, India is a country that is very prone both to droughts and to floods as well as to cyclones. The frequency and intensity of all these three, droughts, floods and cyclones, is expected to increase as climate change increases in the Indian subcontinent. This means that we have to be prepared for it, and we have to be prepared for it to be even worse than it is today. This is a huge challenge. Whether it is the preparedness, and now we see that with the Disaster Management Authority in place, our responses are much faster, much better than they were earlier. But we also have to start looking at other issues. what do you and I do in order to make sure that our water use, our energy use is such that it does not lead to peaks and troughs? How do we build our coastal infrastructure, buildings, the ones that you and I live in, so that they are not destroyed by each cyclone? We need to figure out that when we have more water, how do we store it so that it is available when we have less water? We have a huge problem with reservoir-based dams because they displace people. Are there other options? Should we start filling the empty aquifers with the water when we have it? In other words, there are a range of things that you and I can do. There are a range of things where policy is needed, and there's a range of things where codes, for example, building codes, would need to be modified.
We are looking at the area of energy conservation, energy management, and also including the communities in the whole cycle.
Yes, and we are also looking at water management, and we are also looking at communications.
Fine. Mr. Mathur, what are the pending reforms in the energy sector that you think we really need to take?
The most important reform that is needed is getting the prices right for the rate at which electricity is sold to you and me.
Okay.
Today, the prices are such that the electricity distribution companies make a loss on each unit of electricity that they sell. So, particularly when electricity is expensive, in the heat of summer, they would rather drop a load than buy the electricity that is available. And as I said earlier, today we have more electricity available than is bought. We need, therefore, a system in which we can ensure that the distribution companies make enough money, but at the same time, the costs don't become prohibitive for you and I.
Okay. So you've also headed the energy engineering division in TERI in the past, but now you are the head of TERI. What is your agenda now for TERI as well as for the sector?
TERI has to be in a place where it can help, it can facilitate transformative action. Transformative action towards a more sustainable world. So whether it is in the energy area, the water area, the agricultural area, it needs to focus on those kinds of things. So renewables is one thing, industrial energy efficiency is another, crop productivity is a third, and so on. The second is, these actions have to be based on the research that TERI does. So there has to be a contribution, an intellectual contribution to what we are bringing to the field. The third is, in order for these intellectual contributions to make a difference, we need outreach. Therefore, we need to talk to all kinds of stakeholders, figure out what is it that it will take them to adopt this new technology or new idea so that the change can happen. So what I'm looking forward to is TERI becoming an agent of transformative change in this country and beyond this country.
Fine, sir. So our best wishes with you for your new role as the TERI chief, and thanks very much for talking to us.
Wonderful to have been with you.
Thank you. So that's all we have for you in this edition of Talking Point. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.